There is a sound that I remember. It lives somewhere beneath the surface of all other memories, buried like a coin pressed deep into wet earth. It is the sound of bare feet on limestone, small feet, unsteady feet, climbing steps that seem to rise forever into the white sky above Corinth. I could not have been more than 6 years old. Perhaps I was 7. The years have taken even that certainty from me, worn it smooth the way the sea wears smooth the edges of broken pottery, until what remains is only a shape, a suggestion of what once was whole. I remember the heat first, not the temple, not the goddess, the heat. It lay across the city like a hand pressing down on everything beneath it, heavy and unmoving, the kind of heat that makes the air itself visible, rippling above the pale stone roads in long trembling waves. The cicadas screamed from the olive groves below the hill, a sound so constant and so shrill that it became a kind of silence, a wall of noise behind which all other sounds grew muffled, distant, as though heard from under water. My mother's hand was around mine. I remember that her fingers were damp with sweat and that they trembled, though I did not understand then what the trembling meant. I thought perhaps she was cold. Children understand so little of the grief that moves through the bodies of adults, the way sorrow can make a hand shake even in the height of summer. We climbed. The steps of the great Temple of Aphrodite rose up the slope of the Acrocorinth in a long, pale procession, each one broad and shallow and worn at its centre by the passage of countless feet over centuries beyond my imagining. The stone was warm beneath my soles, not merely warm, it held the memory of every hour of sunlight it had absorbed since dawn, and the heat pressed into the soft skin of my feet with a dull, insistent ache, as though the earth itself were trying to speak to me, to warn me, to say, "Turn back, child, turn back." But I did not turn back. I climbed. My mother climbed beside me, and above us the temple waited. I had seen it before, of course. Everyone in Corinth had seen it. You could not look toward the high hill without seeing the great colonnade, the rows of fluted columns that rose against the sky like the fingers of some vast and ancient hand, pale and unmoving, catching the light of the sun and holding it in long vertical bands of gold and shadow. But I had only ever seen it from below, from the crowded streets of the lower city, where the merchants spread their canopies of dyed linen and the smell of roasting fish drifted from the harbour stalls. From there, the temple was a distant thing, beautiful in the way that clouds are beautiful, something that belonged to the sky and not to me. Now, as we climbed, it grew larger with every step, and its beauty changed. It became something heavier, something that pressed upon the chest. The columns, as we drew near, were enormous. I remember tilting my head back, until my neck ached, trying to see where they ended, and finding that they seemed not to end at all, but to merge with the brightness of the sky itself, their capitals dissolving into light. They were carved from limestone that had once been white, but had aged over the decades into a colour I can only describe as the colour of old bone, a faint warmth beneath the paleness, a suggestion of yellow, of amber, as though the stone remembered a time when it had been alive. At their bases, where the columns met the stylobate, there were thin lines of dark green moss growing in the crevices, and I remember staring at that moss with the desperate focus of a child who does not want to look at what lies ahead. I studied the tiny, soft fronds of it. I held my mother's hand and I did not look up, but the smell reached me before anything else about the temple's interior could. It came drifting down the steps and through the columns in a slow, heavy current, like water moving through still air. Myrrh. I know the name now, but then I knew only the sensation of it. A thickness in the throat, a sweetness that was not quite sweet, something darker underneath it, resinous and warm and faintly bitter, the way the last ember of a fire smells when it is almost ash. Mixed with the myrrh was something sharper, frankincense perhaps, or cassia, and beneath that the faintest trace of something floral, roses crushed and left to dry in copper bowls. The incense smoke was visible where it caught the light between the columns, drifting in slow, pale ribbons that curled and dissolved and reformed, never still, never quite gone. It stung my eyes. I blinked and the world blurred, and through the blur I saw for the first time the dark interior of the temple opening before me like a mouth. There were women standing in the shadowed portico. I could not see their faces clearly. The transition from the blinding sunlight to the shade beneath the roof was too sudden, and for a long moment they were only shapes, dark silhouettes against the deeper darkness within. But I could hear them. They were chanting. The sound was low and measured, a slow, rhythmic murmur that rose and fell like breathing, like the tide, each voice blending into the others until no single voice could be distinguished from the whole. It was not singing, not exactly. It was something older than singing, something that seemed to come from the stone itself, from the deep foundations of the temple, vibrating upward through the floor and into the air. The words were ancient. I did not understand them. I do not think they were meant to be understood. They were meant to be felt, the way one feels the low rumble of thunder long before the storm arrives, a vibration in the bones, a heaviness in the blood. My mother stopped walking. I felt her hand tighten around mine, a brief and desperate pressure, and then slowly, finger by finger, she let go. The absence of her touch was a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. It spread up my arm and into my chest and settled there like a stone dropped into still water, sending out slow, silent ripples. I turned to look at her. Her face was very still. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, or rather, she was holding the crying somewhere deep inside herself, behind the stillness of her face, the way a dam holds back a river. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was a moment, brief, infinite, in which the whole of everything that would follow was suspended between us, unsaid and unsayable. Then one of the women from the portico stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder, and the moment ended. The woman's hand was cool and dry. Her fingers were long and thin, and they rested on my shoulder with a pressure that was neither gentle nor firm, but simply present, the weight of a fact that could not be altered. She smelled of the incense. It clung to her robes, to her hair, to her skin, so completely that she seemed to be made of it, a creature formed from smoke and myrrh and shadow. She did not speak to my mother. She did not look at my mother. She looked only at me, and her eyes were dark and calm and utterly without expression, like the surface of a well so deep that no light reaches the water below. I was led inside. The floor beneath my feet changed from the warm roughness of sun-heated limestone to the cool, impossibly smooth surface of polished marble, and the shock of that coldness travelled through my entire body. The marble was dark, a deep, veined grey, almost black in the places where the lamplight did not reach, and it reflected the tiny flames of the oil lamps in long, distorted streaks of gold. The lamps were everywhere. They hung from bronze chains attached to the ceiling beams. They sat in niches carved into the walls. They rested on low stone ledges along the inner colonnade, and each one produced a small, trembling circle of amber light that pushed feebly against the vast darkness surrounding it. The ceiling was lost in shadow. I could not see it. I could only sense its height, an immensity of empty air above me, pressing down with its own invisible weight. At the far end of the great hall, barely visible through the haze of incense smoke that hung in the air like gauze, there stood the statue of the goddess. She was enormous. She was taller than any person I had ever seen, taller than the doorways we had passed through, her head rising into the dimness above the reach of the lamplight. Her body was ivory, her robes were gold, and her face was the face of perfect, absolute, terrifying calm. She looked out over the hall with eyes that saw everything and felt nothing. Her lips were slightly parted, as though she were about to speak, but she did not speak. She would never speak. She would only watch, forever, as the smoke curled around her golden shoulders, and the chanting rose and fell, and the small bare feet of children crossed her marble floor. They washed me. The water was cold and scented with rose oil, and it was poured over my head from a shallow bronze vessel held by hands I could not see. They combed my hair. They dressed me in a garment of undyed linen that hung to my ankles and scratched faintly against my skin. And then the woman who had first placed her hand upon my shoulder leaned close, so close that I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small imperfections in the stillness of her face, and she spoke a name. A single name, whispered into the incense-heavy air between us. It was not my name. It was not the name my mother had given me, the name she had murmured into my hair at night when the house was dark and the sound of the sea came through the window. It was a new name, a temple name, a name that belonged to the goddess. I did not repeat it. I did not need to. It settled over me like a garment heavier than the linen they had dressed me in, heavier than the smoke, heavier than the heat. It pressed itself against my skin and sank inward, displacing something, and in its place there was only silence, and the smell of myrrh, and the slow, ceaseless murmur of the chanting. Behind me, the great bronze doors of the temple swung closed. The sound they made was low and deep and final, a resonance that travelled through the marble floor and into the soles of my bare feet, and up through the bones of my legs and into the centre of my chest, where it remained. I did not turn around. There was nothing behind me now. Only the goddess, only the smoke, only the long, long night ahead. The years did not pass. That is not the right word for what they did. They accumulated. They settled one upon another, like layers of dust on a ledge that no one thinks to clean, each day so nearly identical to the one before it that the mind could find no edge, no seam, no place where one ended and the next began. I grew. My body changed in ways that the priestesses noted with quiet, clinical attention, the way a farmer notes the ripening of fruit, not with wonder, not with tenderness, but with the calm satisfaction of an investment yielding its expected return. I was perhaps 13 when they moved me from the dormitory of the younger girls to the chambers of the Hierodule, the sacred servants, the women who belonged to Aphrodite, in the fullest and most complete sense of that belonging. I was perhaps 13, I am not certain. Time inside the temple was not measured in years, it was measured in rituals. The days began before dawn, always before dawn. I would wake in the darkness of my chamber, a small room, narrow as a grave, with walls of plastered stone and a single high window through which no light yet entered. And for a moment, the briefest of moments, I would not know where I was. There was a space between sleep and waking, thin as the edge of a blade, in which I was no one, in which the name they had given me had not yet settled back into my body, and in that space there was something that I can only call relief. It lasted the length of a single breath. Then the sound of the morning bell would reach me, a low bronze tone that moved through the corridors like something liquid, seeping under doors and through stone, and the name would return, and the weight of it, and the day would begin. The washing came first. It always came first. In a low-ceilinged room at the eastern end of the temple complex, where the floor sloped gently toward a central drain cut into the stone, we would stand in rows, 6 of us, sometimes 8, sometimes more, while the attendants poured water over our bodies from wide-mouthed clay vessels. The water was drawn from the sacred spring that fed the temple's cistern, and it was always cold. Shockingly cold, in a way that made the skin contract and the breath catch and the mind go blank with the simple animal urgency of sensation. It smelled faintly of minerals, of iron, of the deep earth through which it had travelled before reaching us. It ran down my shoulders and along the curve of my spine, and pooled briefly in the hollows of my collarbones before spilling over and continuing its descent, carrying with it whatever remained of the night, the warmth of sleep, the residue of dreams, the last faint traces of whoever I might have been in the darkness. By the time the washing was complete, I was clean. I was always clean. Cleanliness was the first requirement. The goddess demanded purity of surface, if nothing else. After the water came the oil. The attendants worked it into our skin with slow, methodical hands, beginning at the shoulders and moving downward in long, even strokes that followed the grain of the muscle beneath. The oil was pressed from olives grown in the temple's own groves on the lower slopes of the Acrocorinth, and it was blended with essences that varied according to the season and the occasion. Rose in the spring, when the bushes along the temple walls burst into heavy, nodding bloom. Myrtle in the months of festival. Jasmine on the nights of the new moon, when the darkness outside the temple was absolute, and the lamps within seemed to burn with a fiercer, more desperate light. The scent sank into the skin and remained there for hours. A second skin, an invisible garment that announced what I was before any word was spoken. I could smell myself constantly. Even now, decades later, the scent of olive oil, warmed by human skin, can stop me in mid-step, can close my throat, can send me back to that low-ceilinged room with its sloping floor and its rows of silent, glistening women standing like statues that had been oiled for preservation. Then the hair. A woman named Phaedra, old, silent, her own hair the colour of iron filings, would sit behind me on a low stool and draw a comb of carved bone through my hair with a patience that bordered on cruelty. Each stroke began at the crown of my head and travelled the full length, pulling through every tangle, every knot, with a slow, relentless insistence that sent small sparks of pain across my scalp. She never spoke. In all the years she combed my hair, I do not think she spoke more than a dozen words to me. Her silence was not unkind. It was simply complete. The silence of someone who had long ago concluded that language was unnecessary for the task at hand. When the combing was finished, and it was never finished quickly, She would comb and comb until the hair lay flat and heavy and shining, until it moved as a single sheet, like dark water pouring over my shoulders. She would begin the braiding. Her fingers were deft and certain. They wove the strands together in patterns that I could feel but never see, elaborate configurations that wound around my head and were pinned in place with slender bronze pins tipped with tiny golden beads. The pins were cold against my scalp. They pressed into the skin with small, precise points of discomfort that I learned to carry without acknowledgement, the way one learns to carry any constant low-grade pain, not by overcoming it, but by simply ceasing to distinguish it from the ordinary texture of being alive. The men came in the afternoon. They came in the evening. They came on certain festival nights in the small hours before dawn, when the lamps had burned low and the incense smoke lay thick and unmoving in the heavy air. They came from the harbour, smelling of salt and tar and the peculiar metallic tang of foreign coins. They came from the agora, their beards oiled, their sandals new, their eyes carrying the particular brightness of men who have convinced themselves that what they are about to do is holy. They came from the countryside, from the olive groves and the vineyards, their hands rough, their faces darkened by the sun, moving through the temple's inner corridors with the cautious, reverent steps of men entering a space they do not fully understand. They came singly. They came in pairs. During the great festivals of the goddess, they came in numbers that required us to be organized in shifts, the priestesses managing the flow of supplicants with the quiet efficiency of women accustomed to the logistics of devotion. The faces blurred. That happened quickly, more quickly than I would have expected. Within the first year, I could no longer distinguish one from another in my memory. They became a single face, a composite, a palimpsest of features written one upon another until none remained legible. Dark eyes, light eyes, eyes that looked away, beards that scratched, beards that were soft with oil, mouths that murmured the goddess's name, mouths that said nothing at all. Hands, so many hands, each pair different in its particulars, the calluses, the length of the fingers, the temperature of the skin, and yet identical in their intent, reaching for something that I could not give because it did not exist, because what they sought was not a woman, but an idea, a doorway, a passage to the divine that they believed ran through the body of a girl anointed with rose oil and draped in myrtle blossoms. And through it all, the smell of myrrh. Always the myrrh. It burned in bronze censers placed at the four corners of every chamber. It infused the linens, the cushions, the woolen hangings on the walls. It lived in my hair, in the creases of my palms, in the spaces between my fingers. I breathed it in and breathed it out, and it became indistinguishable from the act of breathing itself, so that to this day, when I inhale deeply, I half expect to taste that dark, resinous sweetness at the back of my throat, that ghost of smoke that never fully leaves. It was evening. The light through the high window of my chamber had turned the colour of old amber, thick and golden and slow, and the sounds of the temple had settled into the low, murmuring hum that preceded the night's rituals. I was alone for a moment, a rare thing, a precious thing, and I reached for the mirror that lay on the stone ledge beside my sleeping pallet. It was a disc of polished bronze, slightly convex, its surface scratched by years of handling, and it gave back a reflection that was never quite sharp, never quite true, as though it insisted on showing not what was there, but only an approximation, a suggestion. I held it up. The face that looked back at me was still young, still beautiful by the standards that mattered within these walls. But there, at the outer corner of the left eye, so faint that in any other light I might have missed it, there was a line, a single, fine, barely perceptible line, no deeper than a thread laid upon the skin, and beside it the faintest shadow of another beginning to form, a whisper of a crease that had not been there the morning before, or the morning before that, or perhaps had been there for weeks, for months, deepening so gradually that only now, in this particular quality of amber light, did it become visible. I set the mirror down. The bronze made a small, flat sound against the stone. I did not pick up the mirror again that night. It did not happen all at once. That is the mercy and the cruelty of it, that the diminishment came not as a single blow, but as a slow, steady recession, like a tide pulling away from a shore so gradually that the sand does not know it is being exposed until it feels the air upon it, cool and unfamiliar, and understands that the water is not coming back. The first thing I noticed was the oil. For years, more years than I can count with any certainty, for time within the temple had always moved in circles rather than lines, the oil that was worked into my skin each morning had been the finest the temple possessed. It was pressed from the first harvest of the temple's oldest grove on the south-facing slope where the sun was strongest and the fruit ripened to a deep, almost black purple. This oil had a particular quality. It absorbed into the skin quickly, leaving not a heavy sheen but a soft, almost imperceptible luminosity, as though the skin itself had begun to produce its own light. And the essences blended into it were the most costly the temple could procure: lotus absolute, spikenard, the distilled essence of blue water lily, each drop worth more than a labourer's weekly wage. I do not remember the exact morning when the oil changed. That is the nature of such transitions. They are designed not to be noticed, not to provoke complaint, but simply to establish a new reality so quietly that by the time it is recognised, it has already become the way things are. But there came a morning when the attendant's hands moved over my shoulders, and I became aware, gradually, of a difference. The oil was heavier. It sat upon the skin rather than sinking into it. The scent was still pleasant, but it lacked the depth, the complexity of what I had known before. It was rose oil, simple and unblended, the same oil given to the Hierodule of the middle rank. I said nothing. There was no one to say it to. And I understood, not in my mind, not yet, but somewhere deeper in the body itself, that a judgment had been made, not spoken, simply enacted, the way the temple enacted all of its decisions, through the quiet redistribution of resources, the imperceptible shifting of privilege from one vessel to another. The finer oil was now being given to Melina. She was perhaps 15. Her skin had the particular quality of skin that has never known worry, a smoothness so complete that it seemed almost artificial. I watched the attendants work the precious oil into her shoulders one morning as I passed the doorway of the preparation room, and I saw how it disappeared into her skin instantly, effortlessly, as though her body were drinking it, and I understood that this was what youth was, not a quality of the face, but a kind of porousness, an ability to absorb, to take in, to be filled, and I understood that I had lost it. The men noticed before I did, or rather the men's choices made visible what I had not yet been willing to see. The wealthier supplicants, the merchants with their rings of gold, the ship captains with their offerings of silver, the visiting dignitaries whose patronage the temple cultivated with particular care, these men were guided elsewhere. To Melina, to Daphne, who was 17 and whose laughter could be heard from the courtyard in the evenings, bright and careless as the sound of water over stones. The men who were directed to my chamber now were different, older, many of them, sailors whose bodies bore the evidence of decades at sea, farmers from the inland villages who came to the temple once a year, having saved their coins through months of labour, men whose own ageing made them less discerning, or perhaps more compassionate, or perhaps simply less valuable to the temple's economy, and therefore matched with a Hierodule whose own value had similarly diminished. The exchange was precise in its mathematics, though no one ever spoke of it as an exchange. It was always spoken of as the will of the goddess. My chamber was moved. I was told that the room I had occupied for so many years was needed for repairs, the plaster was cracking, the damp from a faulty cistern had begun to seep through the inner wall, and that I would be more comfortable in a room at the western end of the complex. The western end. I understood. The western chambers were smaller, lower-ceilinged, farther from the central hall, where the statue of the goddess stood in her eternal golden silence. They received only the light of the setting sun, a heavier, redder light, the light of endings, of things moving toward their conclusion. The room had a single oil lamp, a bronze mirror smaller and more heavily scratched than my previous one, and a narrow window through which I could see the uppermost branches of a cypress tree that moved in the wind with a slow, heavy motion, like something swaying under water. Its dry needles made a sound that was almost but not quite a whisper, and that sound became, over the weeks that followed, the primary soundtrack of my solitude. I began to spend time in the temple's outer courtyard, in the late afternoons when my services were not required, which was more and more often now, the gaps between summons stretching from hours into days and from days into weeks. From the low wall at the courtyard's edge, I could see the harbour and the sea beyond it, a vast flat expanse of blue that darkened toward the horizon in gradations so subtle that the eye could not determine where one shade ended and the next began. I would sit and watch the ships move slowly across that surface, their sails pale and small as the wings of moths, and I would try to remember what it had felt like to believe that what I did within these walls had meaning, that the goddess was real, that her favour flowed through my body, that I was not merely a vessel, but a sacred conduit, a living prayer. I could not remember. The belief had left me so gradually that I could not identify the moment of its departure, only its absence, a hollowness where something had once been, an empty room in which the furniture had been removed piece by piece, until nothing remained but the marks on the floor where the legs had stood. The day came in autumn. The light was thin and pale, the colour of watered wine, and the wind carried the smell of dry leaves and cooling stone, and the faint, acrid tang of smoke from the olive wood fires the servants had begun to light against the first genuine chill. A priestess came to my chamber. She was young, younger than me by many years, which was itself a measure of how far I had receded, that this task had been assigned to someone so junior. She stood in the doorway and did not enter. She told me that the goddess had been generous, that my years of service had brought honour to the temple and favour to the city, that Aphrodite, in her infinite compassion, was now releasing me from my sacred obligation so that I might spend my remaining years in the freedom of the world beyond the walls. She used the word freedom. She spoke it without irony, as though it were a gift rather than a sentence, as though the world beyond the walls was something I had been longing for rather than a vast, unknown darkness into which I was being cast, with nothing but a few pieces of linen and a body that the goddess had used and the goddess had finished with. I packed. There was almost nothing to pack. A comb of carved bone, a spare garment, undyed, much washed, soft with age, a small clay vessel that had once held perfumed oil and now held nothing but still carried, in the porous walls of its interior, the faintest ghost of rose. I walked through the corridor toward the outer gate. The lamps were lit. The myrrh was burning. Somewhere deep within the temple, the chanting had begun for the evening ritual, that low, rhythmic murmur I had first heard as a child on the steps outside. And it followed me as I walked, not calling me back, not bidding me farewell, but simply continuing, as it had always continued, as it would always continue, indifferent to my presence, indifferent to my absence, the sound of something that had never needed me at all. The house, if it could be called a house, was made of mud brick and dry reeds. It stood at the far edge of the settlement that clung to the western outskirts of Corinth, like lichen clings to the shaded side of a stone, without ambition, without intention, simply persisting because the conditions were just barely sufficient for persistence and nothing more. The walls were the colour of the earth from which they had been formed, a pale, exhausted brown that the sun had bleached further still until they seemed less like walls than like the idea of walls, the memory of shelter rendered in the most minimal possible terms. The roof was low and flat and made of bundled reeds laid across a frame of salvaged timber, and in the summer months, when the heat pressed down upon the outskirts with a weight that made the air itself seem solid, the reeds would dry and shrink, and small gaps would open between them, letting in thin blades of sunlight that moved slowly across the dirt floor as the hours passed, marking time in lines of gold and shadow. I had been here for many years. How many, I could not say with certainty. The seasons had come and gone and come again, each one indistinguishable from its predecessor in the way that waves are indistinguishable from one another when viewed from a great enough distance, each unique in its particulars, each identical in its essential nature, rising and falling and withdrawing and returning in a rhythm that required nothing of me except that I remain present to witness it. The winters were cold, the rain came through the gaps in the reeds and formed small puddles on the dirt floor that I would cover with rags and wait for the sun to reclaim. The summers were hot, a different heat than the heat of the temple, which had been softened by the coolness of marble and the shade of high ceilings and the constant slow movement of incense smoke through still air. This heat was unmediated. It came directly from the sky and pressed itself against the mud brick walls and entered through the doorway, which had no door but only a piece of coarse cloth hung from a wooden rod, and it settled into every surface and every object and every fold of fabric and every crease of skin with a thoroughness that left no refuge, no corner of coolness, no escape. The dust was everywhere. It was the defining substance of this place, the element in which all other elements were suspended. It rose from the unpaved paths when the wind blew and hung in the air for hours, a fine pale haze that turned the sunlight amber and coated the tongue with a taste of chalk and dry earth. It settled on the ledge where I kept my water jar. It gathered in the folds of my garment, in the creases of my palms, in the shallow hollows beneath my eyes. I had long since stopped trying to remove it. It was not dirt, not exactly. It was the residue of the land itself, the fine particulate remainder of everything that had ever stood here and crumbled. Old walls, old roads, old bones, ground down by time and wind into a powder so fine that it became indistinguishable from air, from breath, from the slow, quiet process of dissolution that governed all things in this place, including me. I did not often think of the temple. That is not true. Let me say it differently. I did not often choose to think of the temple. But the temple thought of me. It came to me unbidden, in fragments, in sensory impressions that arrived without warning and departed without resolution, the sudden, sharp memory of cold marble beneath bare feet, triggered by the coolness of the water jar against my palm on a winter morning. The smell of myrrh conjured from nothing, from the faintest trace of wood smoke drifting from a neighbour's cooking fire, transformed by some alchemy of memory into that thick, dark, resinous sweetness that had once been the air itself. The sound of chanting, rising from the deepest well of recollection, so faint and so distant that I could not be certain whether I was remembering it or imagining it, or simply hearing the wind move through the dry reeds above my head in a rhythm that happened by coincidence to echo the cadence of those ancient, unknowable prayers. The people of the outskirts did not know what I had been, or if they knew, they did not speak of it. I was simply the old woman who lived in the mud-brick house at the edge of the settlement, the one who drew water from the communal well in the early morning before the others arrived, who sat in the shade of her doorway in the long afternoons watching the dust move in the light, who spoke rarely and smiled less and seemed to carry within her a silence so deep and so complete that it discouraged approach. They were not unkind. A woman whose name I never learned would sometimes leave a small basket of figs or a piece of bread outside my doorway, placed there without announcement, without expectation of thanks, the way one leaves an offering at a shrine. Not because one believes the shrine can reciprocate, but because the act of giving is its own completion. I would find the food in the morning, and I would eat it slowly, carefully, tasting each bite with the particular attentiveness of someone for whom each meal might be the last. Not out of despair, but out of a simple, quiet awareness that the body was winding down, that the mechanism which had sustained it for so many decades was growing slower, less certain, less interested in the effort of continuation. My hands had changed. I would look at them sometimes, in the mornings when the light was gentle enough to see by without squinting, and I would study the topography of veins and tendons that had risen to the surface as the flesh beneath them thinned and receded, the way a landscape reveals its underlying structure when the water that once covered it withdraws. The knuckles were swollen, the fingers, which had once been slender and smooth, and anointed with oils that cost more than the house I now lived in, were bent slightly at the middle joints, curving inward like the branches of a very old tree that has been shaped by decades of wind into a posture of permanent genuflection. The skin was dry. It had not known oil, fine or otherwise, in years, and the sun and the dust had worked upon it with patient, unhurried industry, turning it to something that resembled parchment, thin and translucent, mapped with lines that told a story I could read, but that no one else would ever ask to hear. And yet there was something. I am trying to find the word for it, and the word does not come easily because it is not a word I had much occasion to use during the years within the temple. Peace. No, that is too large, too deliberate, too freighted with the suggestion of something achieved through effort or intention. What I felt was smaller than peace. It was the absence of weight. It was the slow, almost imperceptible lifting of something that had pressed upon me for so long that I had ceased to recognize it as pressure, the way a fish does not recognize water, the way a stone does not recognize the earth in which it is buried. The goddess was gone. Not dead. I did not think in terms of the death of gods, but gone from me, removed, lifted, her golden gaze turned elsewhere, toward younger faces, toward smoother skin, toward bodies that could still absorb the oil and carry the garlands, and kneel in the lamplit chambers with the appropriate expression of sacred blankness, she had no use for me. And in having no use for me, she had, at last and without intending it, set me free. Freedom. The priestess had used that word on the day I left the temple, and I had heard it as a cruelty, a final, polished insult delivered in the language of benevolence. But here, in the mud-brick house, in the dust, in the long, slow afternoons of absolute solitude, I began to understand that she had perhaps accidentally spoken the truth. I was free. Free of the washing and the oil and the combing and the garlands and the chanting and the endless, faceless procession of hands reaching for something that was never there. Free of the bronze mirror and its distorted truths. Free of the name they had given me, which had fallen away from me so gradually over the years of exile that I could no longer recall it with certainty, could no longer feel its shape in my mouth, and in its place there was nothing, no name at all, and the nothing was not empty but full of the quiet, unnameable quality of simply being alive without being required to be anything else. The evening came on slowly. It always came on slowly here, at the western edge of the city, where the land sloped gently downward toward the plain, and there was nothing between the settlement and the horizon to interrupt the long, gradual descent of the sun. The light thickened. It moved through the spectrum of amber and copper and rose, and then into the deeper registers, violet, indigo, the colour of bruises fading, the colour of sleep approaching. The shadows in the corners of my room grew longer and softer, losing their edges, merging with one another until the room itself began to dissolve, its boundaries becoming uncertain, its walls retreating into a darkness that was not threatening but merely present, merely patient, merely waiting. I was lying on my pallet. The reeds above me had turned from gold to grey, to a darkness that was indistinguishable from the sky beyond them. Somewhere, far away, impossibly far, as though separated from me, not merely by distance, but by time, by decades, by the whole long, unspooling thread of a life lived and exhausted, I could hear the sounds of the city settling into night. A dog barking, once, twice, then falling silent. The low murmur of voices from a neighbouring house, words I could not distinguish, melting into a soft, indeterminate hum. The creak of a cartwheel on a distant road, turning slowly, fading. The wind moving through the dry grass beyond the settlement with a sound like breathing, like a long, slow exhalation that had been held for years and years and was only now released. The smell of dust was in my nostrils, dry and faintly sweet, the smell of the earth preparing to take something back. And beneath it, so faint that I might have imagined it, so distant that it might have been a memory rather than a sensation, the thinnest possible thread of myrrh carried from somewhere on the evening air, touching the edge of consciousness and then dissolving the way smoke dissolves, the way sound dissolves, the way all things dissolve when they are finally allowed to rest. My eyes were heavy. They had been heavy for a long time, for hours perhaps, or for years, the distinction no longer meaningful, and the effort required to keep them open was no longer an effort I wished to make. The darkness above me was soft. It was the softest thing I had ever known, softer than the linen they had dressed me in on my first night in the temple, softer than the rose petals that had rested against my collarbone, softer than the sound of my mother's voice speaking a name I could no longer remember into a darkness much like this one. I let my eyes close. The sounds of the city grew fainter. The dog did not bark again. The voices faded into the murmur, and the murmur faded into the wind, and the wind faded into the breathing of the grass, and the breathing of the grass faded into silence, and the silence was not empty, was not cold, was not the silence of the temple with its weight of incense and expectation, but a different silence altogether. A silence that asked nothing, required nothing, held nothing, a silence as wide and as deep and as gentle as the sky that stretched above the mud-brick house, and above the outskirts, and above the city, and above the sea, and above all the small, brief, luminous lives that flickered upon the earth, and then softly, softly went out.